Hi, my name is Tina Wang. I'm a Senior Associate at QueenCityLaw. Today I'll be talking about why you may need a contracting out agreement. So to get into this, I'm going to cover three areas. First of all, I'm going to be talking about the act that applies. Then I'm going to be explaining what relationship property is. And then lastly, I'll be talking about contracting out agreements. So firstly, the Property Relationships Act 1976 governs relationships and properties in New Zealand. Typically, it was for couples, but there's been recent case law where, for instance, a guy was married to somebody and then he was also in a relationship with somebody else, and both females brought a claim against the guy, and then it questions how many halves you can have because both women were claiming half of his relationship property. The Property Relationships Act governs relationships in the absence of a contracting out agreement, so you need to understand what the Act is before considering whether you need a contracting out agreement. The Act is quite old. It assumes a sort of mum and dad relationship where all finances are shared. Typically you'd have the husband being the breadwinner and the wife being stay-at-home mum, and so all assets are shared and they're sort of defaulting on the basis that they own assets together jointly and they share finances. That unfortunately doesn't work for most couples nowadays. You have different relationships. The Act covers marriages, civil unions, people in de facto relationships. You ask, what is a de facto relationship? Because nowadays you have 16-year-olds talking about their partner as opposed to their boyfriend or girlfriend. I have had jokes from sort of older males talk about how that every time they'd get married and have a divorce, they'd end up with half their assets gone, and that's the sort of thing that they had to deal with through a relationship breakdown. But that can happen regardless of whether you're married and in a sort of mum and dad relationship that people think that it applies to. So what is a de facto relationship? Because there are common misconceptions about that. People think, oh, well, I'm not in a de facto relationship because I don't live with him, or I'm not in a de facto relationship because she has her own income and doesn't share finances. Well, actually, that's not the overriding factors in a de facto relationship. There are many factors that the court takes into account. The courts look at duration of relationship, whether you've been living together, whether the relationship is sexual, whether there's financial dependence, whether there's ownership of property, degrees of mutual commitment in life, how the public perceives you as a couple, and whether you care and support children, performance of household duties. So you can say that your husband's or your partner's not doing household duties, so they're not in a de facto relationship. But jokes aside, there are some factors that the courts will look at, sometimes above other factors, but it's kind of seen as a joint overall big picture scheme of whether you're in a de facto relationship. So it can be difficult, especially when people are in multiple relationships, unfortunately. The triggering point is 3 years. So once you've been in a relationship for 3 years, whether it be a marriage, civil union or de facto relationship, then the default provision that you have equal share of your relationship property applies. So this is when you start getting serious into your relationship and need to consider whether you have a contracting out agreement or need one. So secondly, what is relationship property? Because that is a term that comes up all the time in the Property Relationships Act and contracting out agreement, and you need to understand what that is. So a common misconception is that relationship property is only the shared ownership of assets that we have, so therefore your separate bank accounts, your separate properties, your income doesn't apply. Well, actually it is. Relationship property is defined very, very generically, so it includes income, which surprises a lot of people. It includes that separate property that you acquired before the relationship. It includes separate bank accounts. So it doesn't look at ownership of names, and this thing for Asian clients especially is a shocker because they think that this property is under my name, so it's all mine. That unfortunately is not the case under New Zealand law. Trust is another misconception because people think, well, that property is in a trust, so therefore it's not going to get a claim from my partner because it's separate property. Well, actually there are many ways that trusts are not watertight. It's not 100%, because if you're putting your own income, which I've just explained is relationship property, into that trust property, you've just intermingled and maybe brought part of it into relationship property space. Also, contributions can bring an intermingled property. So contributions aren't just financial. So if your partner has been going out to that house under your name or the trust name and has been gardening that house every week, or has been painting, was involved in some renovations, they can say, well, I've contributed to that property and therefore I have a share to that property regardless of who owns it. So it's not just about ownership. You need to look at what's happened and think about whether you've just unintentionally intermingled your property assets to make it relationship property. It also includes liabilities and assets. So your partner may think, well, I can claim all of half of his assets, but forget that you might actually be in debt, and so often overlook that you're actually getting half of the debt and the assets. So that's also another misnomer. It is very rare to be able to keep assets completely separate. So nowadays you have people enter relationships and it might be their second, third or fourth, and they think that this property of mine is separate and I will keep it separate, so it has nothing to do with this property and my relationship property and my relationship with this person. However, like I said, if you've unintentionally mixed your assets into it, it becomes intermingled, so it becomes very difficult to keep it completely separate. And if you cannot keep it completely separate, then you need to consider whether you need a contracting out agreement. So lastly, what is a contracting out agreement? So this can be called a prenup, mid-nup, post-nup, which is also a separation agreement. It can be called a Section 21 agreement because that's the relevant section under the Property Relationships Act that you're contracting out of. So basically, like I said, under the Property Relationships Act, couples or people in relationships are entitled to half of the relationship assets. So if you do not want to revert to the default position, you need to contract out of that position and enter into an agreement. So a contracting out agreement is very different from any other agreement because it needs to be fair, it needs to take into account all of your assets, and so there is a requirement of full disclosure. So parties entering into it need to be able to say, these are my full assets, so they can't hide assets and pretend that it's not there or lie to their spouse about it, because it needs to be upfront and be dealt with fairly and squarely. Each party needs to get independent legal advice, and not only would that lawyer be advising you on the agreement and witnessing the agreement, they need to certify that it's fair and that they've complied with the requirements under the Act. So it is a bit of a process to go through. It's something that you need to think about in terms of asset protection for yourself, because without a Section 21 agreement, the default process of half shares apply. If you don't have a Section 21 agreement and you pass away without leaving your spouse or partner half of your assets, they can actually claim, even after you've died, a half claim of your estate. So that's something that you need to consider, how you want to think about succession and asset protection going forward. So that's a lot to consider, but it is something very serious and important for everybody to be able to consider, because if you're in a relationship, then these Act and provisions will apply to you. Please get legal advice before, not after, things blow up. So we're here to help if you need. Thank you.